Coulter Wilson here, and welcome to Homebrewing DIY. Today we're talking to a great friend and longtime homebrewer, Justin Saba. He is the winner of many gold medals and the maker of great beers. And today we're going to talk about all things brew kettles. How to choose one, how to modify one to your needs, and dive into what we both use for our setups. We're going to get started on brew kettles when we return. Welcome back to Homebrewing DIY. This is a podcast where we discuss the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Contraptions, gadgets, parts, this podcast covers it all. Today we're talking with Justin Saba, a very close friend and longtime homebrewer, about picking out a great brew kettle and the different options out there. We will also discuss the different modifications that you can make and discuss our current setups. Support the podcast by clicking on the support link in the description. Any support helps keep us on the air and generally makes this podcast better. Feedback is always appreciated. Ask any homebrew questions, feedback on the show, or just say hi. I would love to hear from you at podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. That's podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. Before we jump into our talk with Justin, I'd like to talk about how I'm going to approach this podcast. Personally, I'm a techie homebrewer. I love electronics that help improve my beer. Maybe it's my background in tech, but it's just the way I think. Over the years, I've built a ton of projects that were beer related, starting with my kettle, to my fermentation chamber, to my digital beer menus in my house. I've always felt that this is just as fun as brewing itself. So, to get started, we're going to focus on that DIY aspect of homebrewing. We may at some point discuss ingredients and beer making, but right now we're going to discuss equipment, mostly DIY equipment. So that being said, let's not put it in a box and see where the show takes us. I'm going to have lots of friends and guests on the show, talking about the projects that they've built. And listeners, if you've built something that you want to share, I'm open to having you on the show as well. Just shoot me an email at podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. Once again, that's podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. All right, let's get talking to Justin Saba. Justin's a very close friend and a very experienced homebrewer. Justin agreed to hop on the show from Salt Lake City, Utah, and discuss one of the most basic parts about homebrewing, and that's brew kettles. Justin, welcome to Homebrewing DIY, and how are you today?
Thank you, Coulter. Thanks for having me on. Doing great.
That's awesome, man. So what I would like to maybe ask you first is, we all started somewhere, and what would you say your first brew kettle looked like?
Well, it was actually, I bought a homebrew kit from Midwest Supplies, and it came with a 5-gallon thin stainless steel kettle. It was kind of flimsy, and so I think I brewed in it once with extract, and then I quickly bought a more sturdy stainless steel 5-gallon kettle. And so that was pretty much it for the for the extract brewing. But yeah, so I used that for a while, doing extract brews. I probably did 4 or 5, I think, on that, and it worked out great. I mean, it was a nice kettle to use. I wouldn't I would definitely suggest, spending a little extra money to get a more sturdy kettle if you can. I know they're making them pretty reasonably priced nowadays, but I just think it's kind of a no-brainer. It just seemed like, and I burned, on my first batch, I kind of burned the bottom of the kettle, the wort in the kettle, and because it was so thin. So, yeah, enough said on that.
Yeah, I guess picking out the right type of thickness of stainless steel can make a huge difference in the quality of the way that the heat is absorbed into the kettle, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I probably could have been a little more careful with that thin one, but it was I don't know, it just seemed like it was just going to fall apart.
When you started out brewing and you were doing extract, how did you get the wort out of the kettle into your fermenter? And were you using the glass carboy? Did you have a funnel? What kind of how did you actually move the wort into whatever you used to ferment it? Okay,
so what I would do is, after I was done boiling it, I would cool it down with I kind of made an immersion chiller with some copper tubing I bought at the hardware store. So I would get it, I would cool it down with water moving through that immersion cooler, and then I would just basically, because my batch was a 5-gallon batch, I only had like 2.5 gallons or so of wort. So I had to actually bump up the volume. And so what I did is I added like distilled water into it was like a 6.5 gallon bucket with that Midwest Supplies kit I had. And then I just dumped the wort in right on top of it. And it kind of was nice because it kind of started aerating it right away by dumping it into that water. And so, yeah, I mean, it was pretty easy. I just dumped it in.
Okay, so you had a bucket. You would just take the cooled wort and then just dump it straight into the bucket.
Yeah.
And then added water to it to top it up. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then and then shake it up pretty good.
You obviously said you did 4 or 5 batches, extract. I think a lot of homebrewers started off that way. When you went all grain, how did you pick a kettle then?
Well, I went big. So I decided what I did is I kind of knew the method I wanted to brew with all grain. I wanted to do brew in a bag. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, brew in a bag is a great method.
Yeah, and so I needed a way, because brew in a bag is just a one vessel brewing, and so I needed a pretty big kettle because I was doing a full volume brew. So you just add all the water that you're going to brew with to the grains in a big bag in that kettle. And so I had to pick about a 15-gallon kettle for that, because I wanted to do 6-gallon batches, but I also wanted to be able to do stuff that's not like that high gravity, but it was pretty decent gravity. So I needed a big enough kettle to accommodate for the grain and the water. So that's what I picked, and worked out pretty good, actually. I bought an aluminum kettle. It was actually aluminum, and off of Amazon. It's been great.
What was the first modification that you made to it?
Well, first thing I did was drill a hole for a valve, because if you can imagine dumping a full volume of wort into a bucket, is just kind of, it's kind of a pain in the ass. It's a lot of weight, and there's a risk of, spilling it. So I wanted to have a valve at the bottom of the kettle so I could just easily drain it into the fermenter. So yeah, I drilled a hole in it and added a ball valve, a weldless ball valve with gaskets and washers on both sides, and it doesn't really, it works out pretty well. I don't really have any problems with leaks at all. I know that's a complaint from a lot of people, but you don't want to over tighten the ball valve on it. Otherwise it could tend to leak. I know that's an issue.
Okay, and drilling that hole, like, did you just get a big drill bit, or was it a step bit? What did you actually use to drill a hole through your kettle?
Yeah, so I used the step bit, but I started out with a small drill bit. I think it was like a 1/8 inch drill bit. What I did is I marked a hole at the bottom of the kettle with a pen, and aluminum is pretty soft, so you also need some kind of lubricant to drill with, because it'll get pretty hot and it tends to seize up on the metal. So with aluminum, though, you can use dish soap. So that's what I used. I just put dish soap on there, and I drilled like kind of a starter hole with a small drill bit, and then I started using the step bit until I got to the hole size needed for that particular ball valve.
Okay, and so then you put the weldless ball valve in, and you're able to then just drain straight from your kettle if you put like your burner up on like a riser or something like that, right?
Yeah. So I had these cinder blocks that I set that my burner would sit on top of, and it gave me enough vertical space to. I just had a silicone tube from the kettle valve, and then going right into the fermenter, and it worked great.
Have you added things like a temperature gauge to your kettle?
Yes, I did the same thing with that. Soon after I added the valve, I got tired of sticking my thermometer in the wort to figure out my temps that I needed for mashing, and so I sprung a little more money and drilled the same hole just a few inches up from the other hole, because you didn't want it too high, because you need it to still be in the wort. The thermometer has to be in the wort, of course, to register the temperature correctly. So I just kind of gauged it. So I went a little below 6 gallons of wort volume in that kettle where I drilled the hole.
And you said that is the current kettle you're using for your brew in a bag today.
Yes. Yeah. And that was from, I think I started doing that in 2013, I would say. I think that's when I started my all grain. Oftentimes I thought about upgrading to a better kettle. I just haven't had the time or need for it yet.
Well, I've had your beer, and I think that you do just fine with that kettle.
Thanks. Yeah, I know a lot of people have their opinions about aluminum, and I was a little worried at first, but I didn't have a lot of money to spend on a kettle, and it really has no effect on the flavor at all, as you know.
Yeah, I'll say that like the first time I ever bought a kettle, I used an aluminum kettle as well. I had a small aluminum kettle for when I did extract batches. The first time I got a turkey fryer, I had a turkey fryer that came with a 7-gallon aluminum kettle, and I did a 3-gallon brew in a bag batch in that, and it was great. It worked really well. It was a good kettle. And then, as you know, I have a 15.5-gallon stainless steel kettle. Used an angle grinder to cut out the top, step bit to cut through and put in the ball valve the same as you. I have a Blickman temperature gauge as well in mine. Also, cool like heat shield for the temperature gauge that some screws into the bottom collar of the keg with some just kind of flat scrap metal to keep around it. It looks kind of like a robo kettle, but does the job and does a really great job.
Yeah, that thing's a beast. It's great. And you're still using that, huh?
Yeah, still use that, brew in a bag, same as you, and I feel like I make really great beer with it. The thing I like about the kegel versus like a thin stainless steel or even aluminum is that it's just really sturdy. It's just a really good quality stainless steel that they use in old decommissioned kegs. If you are going to make a kegel or kettle out of an old keg, it's always good to use a decommissioned keg that isn't in use anymore. You don't want to go down to your liquor store, pay a deposit on a keg, and then use that keg. Technically, you are stealing that keg from the brewery. And so therefore, you want to get a keg that isn't being used anymore, that is too old to be used for beer, maybe has problems holding pressure. And so therefore, you would go in, use an angle grinder to cut the top off and get a good circle that's going to fit your lid. And then from there, you're going to have a really great kettle. And so I can't recommend kegels enough.
Yeah, when I brewed with you and lifting that kegel, it was definitely sturdy. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and cleaning it's also very easy. You get in there, and there are days when you get things like beer stone in your kettle, specifically after a lot of repeated use. And if I get in there with PBW or OxyClean to clean it out, hit it with a little steel wool, and it just like peels right off and gets really clean and real nice.
And I would say that is another advantage over aluminum, being able to use steel wool, because I would definitely scratch my kettle with that. And so I use softer material like a sponge with that. How the sponges, some of them come with kind of like a rough side on one end and then a smooth, soft sponge side on the other. That's what I use when I need to get grime off. I kind of, I'll lightly scrub with that rougher side with the grain of the aluminum around the pot to get the stuff off. But so I have to be a little more careful than you, I think, which is one disadvantage.
Yeah, totally. The other thing is that with aluminum, if you do things like leave OxyClean or PBW in it for too long, it can also pit it.
Yep, that is correct. I have a few pits in mine already, probably from that very thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, what other kind of modifications can you think of for a kettle that somebody might want?
Well, I'd say maybe a volume gauge or
A sight glass?
yeah, like a sight glass, so you can see your volumes that way. Makes it a lot easier to see where your volume's at than trying to look on the inside.
Yeah, the sight glass is kind of like a little addition you make on the outside of the keg, and as you feel it, it tells you how much volume is actually in the keg. So, like, for example, if you have 5 gallons of water in there, you would be able to see it on the outside of the keg through a glass tube that comes out and kind of raises as you feel or lower the water level, right?
Right. And then also, I know whirlpooling is a big thing now in the brewing world. Whirlpooling hops, and seen kettles modified for a whirlpool port. But if you're going to do that, you also need a pump to pump the wort up through the whirlpool port so that it makes a nice, circular motion.
Yeah, so they would put a port in the side and at an angle coming in, right? And so then pump the wort out of the 3-ball valve in the front and back in and recirculate, but do it in a whirlpool motion so that you can kind of collect the hops at the center, right?
Right. Yeah, you would probably have to put on the inside of that port, you would need like an angled tube so that the wort flows at an angle so that you get that whirlpool effect. If you just try to put it on the side, if you just drill a hole and shove wort through there, it's just not going to do much of anything except bubble or move around in a erratic fashion, So
Yeah, and I know that both you and I squeeze our bags when we brew in a bag, but there's a lot of brewers out there that do recirculating mashes. Why don't you talk about what recirculating a mash is?
You've got a pump where you're pumping the wort up from the ball valve of the kettle, and somehow pumping up to the top of the bag back into the wort again, so that you get the wort extraction, more efficiency that way.
Yeah, exactly. Like the idea would be you would maybe put a tube that goes up to some sort of like shower head at the top, and that kind of sprays wort over the top of the mash to kind of really mix it and make sure that it's touching all of the grain. What other kind of kettle modifications can you think of that you've seen out there?
Well, I've seen, as far as like the lid, I've seen where people have angle grinded a notch in the lid so that they can put their immersion chiller in there in the wort and have their lid shut without having the lid dangling off the side, like without a big air gap, because when you're chilling your wort, you're worried about that, stuff floating into the wort as it's cooling, and that's not what you want. Doing that, will help provide a better seal around your wort as it's cooling.
That's awesome. I've actually never thought about that, but that's definitely an issue I have. I have a immersion chiller, and when I put the lid on, it kind of just is propped open. Just taking a small notch out of it would probably solve that issue.
Yeah. I've thought about it myself, but I'm kind of lazy.
I think that's just part of if it hasn't broken something yet, is it really worth the effort? Sometimes that is the dilemma we all have, right?
Right. And and there's a lot to be said about the speed at which we cool our wort, with our immersion chillers. And I've got, as long as you're chilling it down pretty quickly, I can't see, an infection taking over, as long as you're practicing good sanitization.
Yeah, I have one of those jaded the Hydra immersion chiller, and it chills so fast that sometimes I actually have to be honest, if I want to do a hop stand or like a bunch of late edition hops, it almost chills too fast, and so therefore I'll just do a hop stand and not even touch the immersion chiller, just because I can go from boiling to pitching temperature, depending on the temperature of my groundwater, within like 10 minutes. And so that's definitely something you want to think about, is that if you're trying to get like a lot of late edition hops, maybe adding that hop stand in so that you can adjust if you have a really fast immersion chiller. Like knowing the time of your immersion chiller is pretty important, I think.
I agree. Yeah. Your chiller is amazing.
Yeah, I couldn't recommend that thing enough. It's pretty cool. One of the things that people have are starting to add are automatic brewing systems, such as like I've seen the craft beer pie, right, where they're adding PIDs to their kettles and running them off of Raspberry Pis to be able to kind of manage temperatures and heating elements and those types of things, right? So like example would be if you wanted to go electric, adding a heating element to your kettle could be one way to get rid of gas and be able to brew indoors and not have to, have your brew outside in the cold.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of that. People using the pie for that, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Have you ever thought about adding a heating element to your system and going electric?
I have. For me though, it's I have a way I could do that. I just haven't, and it's just time, and it's just like anything else. If it isn't broke, don't fix it, right?
Yeah, totally.
Although it does sound appealing, having an electric and not having to fill my tank up of propane every couple of brews, having to go down to the gas station to fill up my tank. And that would definitely be a plus, I think, to doing that.
Yeah, totally.
Worry about, you need probably a 220 outlet to do to really do it right, I would think. Although there are electric kettles out there now that they're building that'll just take 120. It just takes longer to get up to boil than your mash temps, but for the volume that I have, it would probably be better to have a 220 than a 120.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely want to go that road just because of the size of the batches that I make. If I were to go to electric, definitely has crossed my mind as well. But I still, just like you, haven't really pulled the trigger on that as well. Any kind of cool home brewing projects that you're currently working on?
Not at the moment. I'm not. I'm really proud of the brew pie setup that I made 5 or 6 years ago with you, but that's been about the biggest thing I've done in a while.
I feel like obviously next time I'm in Salt Lake, I would love to brew a batch with you, Justin. But I can't thank you enough for hopping on and having a talk with me about brew kettles and what you've done and what our current setups are, and really just the things you can do to a brew kettle. And there's a lot of modifications you can make.
Yeah, it certainly is. I thanks so much for having me on and talking about my meager attempts at brewing.
They're all meager attempts at brewing. Well, thanks for being on the show, and we'll definitely have you on again and talk all things beer.
Yeah, thanks, Coulter. I appreciate it.
Once again, I'd like to thank Justin for taking the time to be on the show. Please note that if you want to follow the show on social media, you can search for the podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under the handle @homebrewingDIY. Once again, that handle is @homebrewingDIY. And if you like the show and want to leave feedback, you can always send an email. podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. That email again is podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. We have this really cool feature that if you want to leave a voice note for the show, there is a link in the description. Just click on the link and leave us a message. I'd love to hear from you. Last, if you'd like to support the show, please use the link in the description. Any amount helps and keeps this podcast going strong. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Homebrewing DIY.